He doesn't remember the first time he pledged allegiance to something he didn't understand. He was 5, maybe 6, small hand over a small heart, staring at a piece of colored cloth in the corner of a classroom. His voice was too young to even pronounce the words correctly, but his body learned the ritual. Stand up, hand here, eyes there, don't question it. So, you were also handed the same script, and no one told you it was fiction. They called it the American dream. They said if you worked hard enough, if you were good enough, quiet enough, grateful enough, then you would be safe, you would be enough. And if you weren't safe, and if you weren't enough, then the fault was never in the script. The fault was in you. You didn't question it. Instead, your body learned the choreography, your nervous system learned the rhythm, your consciousness learned the script. This is how indoctrination begins. It starts not with arguments, but with muscle memory. Part 1. An open loop. This video is about the American dream, but not the version they sell you in commercials. This is about the psychological architecture underneath it. It's about the propaganda machinery that took a phrase coined in 1931 by a historian named James Truslow Adams, who dreamed of a fairer, more egalitarian life for ordinary people, and then quietly rebuilt it into something else entirely. It was rebuilt into a tool for control and pacification. It was made into a mirror that reflects shame back at anyone who dares question it. For people who have already had a difficult life, this story is not abstract. It is personal. It lives in your nervous system. By the end of this video, you'll understand why, and you might just feel a little less insane for noticing what you've noticed all along. Part 2. The bootstrap and the body. Let's start with the myth of meritocracy, where you get what you deserve because of hard work. The bootstrap narrative tells you that anyone, anywhere, regardless of where they are in life, can pull themselves up by their bootstraps through sheer will and grit and overcome anything. It sounds inspiring. It sounds, on the surface, like freedom. But flip it over and look at the underside. If success is purely about effort, then failure must be purely about laziness or weakness. There is no room in that story for a father who lost his job when the factory closed. No room for a mother raising 3 kids alone on minimum wage. No room for discrimination, generational poverty, or a healthcare system that bankrupts families over a broken bone. The bootstrap narrative doesn't just ignore systemic injustice. It quietly and efficiently relocates the blame for falling short in life into your chest, into your gut, into the same place where shame already lives. Jean-Paul Sartre had a term for this kind of self-deception. He called it bad faith, which is the lie we tell ourselves to avoid an unbearable truth. And the American dream, in its bootstrap form, is bad faith at a national scale. It asks an entire population to believe that outcome always equals effort, so that the winners can feel deserving and the losers can feel guilty. Here's an objection worth voicing honestly. Doesn't hard work matter at all? The answer is, of course it does. Nobody is saying effort is meaningless. The problem isn't hard work in and of itself. The problem is the myth that hard work alone guarantees a specific outcome, and that anything less than that outcome is a character flaw. That distortion is exactly what makes so many people internalize failure as identity instead of circumstance. Part 3. The dream they sold you. Humans are not wired for nations. They are wired for tribes, for small bands of 50 or so people, where everybody knows your name and your wounds. So how do you get 330 million strangers to feel like family, to pay, to obey, and to die for each other? After World War II, something shifted. The American dream stopped being primarily about civic freedom and equal opportunity and started being repackaged as consumerism. Suburban homes, shiny automobiles, a kitchen full of appliances. This became the new finish line. Corporations didn't just sell belongings, they sold belonging. They sold the idea that a mortgage was proof of being in a virtuous in-group, and a new car was proof of arrival for the same wanted in-group. This is where debt becomes an eerie kind of achievement. Mortgages, student loans, and car payments, these aren't just financial tools anymore. They have become emotional anchors, keeping people tethered to an in-group system that profits from their obedience. Here's an eye-opening detail most people never learn. During the Cold War, the United States government literally published a state-run magazine called America, distributed in the Soviet Union, designed to dazzle Soviet citizens with glittering images of American refrigerators, cars, and smiling families. This wasn't organic culture. This was engineered propaganda, government-funded, precisely targeted, using the emotional glow of domestic contentment as a weapon in an ideological war. Hollywood did the same thing on a global scale, exporting a curated fantasy of prosperity that helped justify foreign interventions and market global capitalism as humanity's only rational endpoint. Jean Baudrillard, the French philosopher, would later describe this kind of phenomenon as hyper-reality, an idea so seductive it becomes more emotionally real than the truth it was based on. The American dream, in its consumerist form, is hyper-real. It is the illusion of safety, security, and belonging sold to people yearning for the real thing. Part 4. Us versus them. Nationalist propaganda doesn't just sell a lifestyle, it sells belonging to an imagined community, a term coined by political scientist Benedict Anderson to describe how strangers come to feel like family simply because they share a flag. Millions of people who will never meet, never speak, and never share a moment are taught to feel an emotional bond so strong they'll pay taxes, obey laws, and even die for strangers. It's a staggering psychological achievement. This emotional bond is manufactured through biased history curriculums approved by the State Board of Education, daily pledges of allegiance, national anthems at sporting events, and the elevation of soldiers and founders into something close to secular saints. This technique uses the ingenious trick of moral blackmail. If you question the war, you are told you are disrespecting the troops. If you question the police, you are told you hate heroes. The critique of a policy is magically transformed into a personal insult against a good person. This binary thinking of democracy against tyranny, civilization against barbarism, and good against evil strips away the messy economic and historical realities underneath every conflict. It replaces complexity with a fairy tale, and fairy tales are consumed precisely because they're simple. Frantz Fanon wrote extensively about how colonized people can internalize the hatred of the systems that oppressed them and turn that into self-hate. Many people internalize the American dream's judgment of them long before they ever consciously examine whether the dream itself is honest. Part 5. The perpetual threat state. The state manufactures fear, but not overwhelming fear that would cause panic. Instead, it creates a low-level, continuous anxiety by enemies of the people. A 2022 study, Fight or Flight for America, by sociologist Michael J. Rotolo, suggests that the state capitalizes on this perpetual threat state. It does so by maintaining an atmosphere of continuous fear regarding foreign adversaries, terrorists, immigrant caravans, and national internal subversives to convince the citizens to willingly surrender their civil liberties. Neuroscience is clear on this. When your brain's amygdala is activated by fear, your prefrontal cortex, which is the part responsible for critical thinking, goes offline. You become more suggestible. You will willingly hand over freedom, privacy, and money in exchange for the promise of safety. And then, layered on top of fear, comes the myth of national exceptionalism, which is the idea that our country is uniquely righteous, uniquely chosen, and uniquely superior. It's a comforting story, but also a dangerous one. The idea of exceptionalism blinds people. It convinces them that ethical standards apply to everyone else, but not to them. As philosopher Hannah Arendt, who watched the rise of totalitarianism up close, warned, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist." Part 6. The feed that never sleeps. There's a newer, quieter chapter to this story, one that plays out on your phone right now. The old propaganda relied on blocking information and censoring what people could see. The new version doesn't bother blocking anything. Instead, the new method floods the feed. Bot networks, paid commentators, AI-generated accounts and algorithmic noise bury inconvenient truths under an avalanche of distraction, outrage, conspiracies, half-truths, and 10 competing narratives about the same event. In other words, nonsense. Then, exhausted people quietly conclude that truth itself is unknowable. Psychologists call this learned helplessness. That conclusion is not an accident. Confusion is easier to manage than a genuinely informed and angry population. A confused citizen rarely organizes for change. Governments and platforms increasingly work hand in hand, shaping which stories rise to the top of the feed and which quietly disappear. Plato, 2,400 years ago, described this perfectly in his Allegory of the Cave. Prisoners chained in a cave, watching shadows on a wall, mistake those shadows for the real world. Plato asked, "What if someone controls the fire that casts the shadows? If so, then you don't need to chain people, as you can control them by what they see." And here is a little-known, dreadful piece of history that proves how deliberate this is. In 1950, during Operation Mockingbird, it was declassified that the CIA had paid hundreds of journalists at major American networks and newspapers to publish stories that were favorable to state interests during the Cold War. Part 7. The reality gap. Here is the staggering, almost unbelievable statistic that exposes the whole illusion. Over 90% of American children born in 1940 grew up to earn more than their parents. For children born in the 1980s, that number collapsed to roughly 50%. Social mobility has since stalled. Inequality has skyrocketed, and yet the American dream persists, not because it's true, but because it's useful. And the marketing never stops either. Politicians on every side of the aisle still invoke the American dream to sell policy, whether it's deregulated capitalism or expanded safety nets, because the phrase triggers something deep and emotional, including patriotic nostalgia, family loyalty, and hope. Reasonable people might ask, isn't some hope necessary? Shouldn't we believe in something better? Absolutely yes. The goal here isn't to extinguish hope, it's to separate authentic hope from manufactured hope. Part 8. What this means. If you grew up believing that questioning the system meant betraying it, you were not weak. You were marketed to, from infancy, by one of the most sophisticated propaganda apparatuses in human history. You might feel guilty for questioning the nation you were taught to love. You might feel angry, realizing how deeply you were manipulated. You might feel lonely because most people never reach this level of awareness. These emotions are not signs of weakness, they are signs of awakening. Albert Camus once wrote that the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a human heart, even without the summit ever being reached. Maybe that's the real dream, worth keeping. The real dream is not about the mansion or the mythology, it's choosing the red pill in the matrix. It's the honest, unglamorous act of building meaning in your life on your own terms, in a world that profits from you never knowing you had that choice all along. And that is the real dream, not the American one and not the nationalist one, but the human one. The dream of waking up, the dream of becoming free, and the dream of returning to yourself.